Okay, good morning again. It's now 5 past 10. My name is Lawrence Asani from the Research Capacity Development at the University of Johannesburg, Postgraduate School. I am delighted to be your moderator for today's workshop. Um, can I just confirm if I am audible enough, if everybody can able to hear me? They just confirm with a thumbs up. You can all
I
hear
can hear
me.
you. I can hear you fine. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I'd like to start off by thanking all the attendees for taking the time to join us, and most importantly, our presenter today, Dr. Hannah Dawson, for her efforts and preparing to give this presentation on thesis format and submission procedure. So before I begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping rules. Please note that if you have any question, during the workshop or during the presentation, please raise your hand and I will indicate to the presenter that you have any question and we may unmute your mic and you may speak. And please note that also the workshop is recorded and all the workshop slides and recording will be posted on the model communities at the end of the week. And also a feedback survey will be forwarded in the chat session. Please note that we will use this feedback survey for the improvement of our workshop. So we request you to kindly fill it in and also please provide some kind words to our facilitators. So before I begin the session, I would like to go over Dr. Hannah's Dawson's bio. So Dr. Hannah Dawson is a senior lecturer in the Anthropology and Development Studies Department at the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Hannah has a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Oxford and MPhil in international development from the same institution. Dr. Hannah's research grapples with the social, economic, and political shifts stemming from mass unemployment and the ways in which the future of work and welfare is being imagined and transformed in Southern Africa. She has approached this from a range of projects, including a study of how young people are making lives and livelihood outside of wage employment, digital technologies, and the changing nature of work and popular demands and policymaking around more expensive cash transfers. In addition, her previous research examined political protests and the political subjectivities of unemployment of young people. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to our facilitator today, Dr. Hannah. You may proceed and begin the session. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thanks. I see we got 63 people here so far, so I think that's a good turnout. So thanks for making the time. And so I think officially this session was advertised as format and submission, and you'll see that, I am going to speak for 1 or 2 slides on the technical aspects of, exactly what a thesis needs to look like at UJ. But from my experience, that is not the aspect of writing a thesis and finalizing a thesis that people get really stuck on. It's more the substantial questions of what should an introduction look like, what should the methodology chapter look like, how to write it in the way in which it brings it together as a kind of coherent whole. So you'll see as we go that I'm going to speak to more of the substantial issues rather than just something like formatting. But I will touch upon that. So what I called the session, why can't I move my slides? That's weird. There we go. Okay. So thank you for the introduction. So I think you have a sense of my background, and I think it is important in a session like this that although we're all in the humanities, that there are differences in everything from kind of how we write theses to different kind of conceptual and theoretical frameworks, that a lot is similar, but there are some important differences across disciplines. And so I say that, you should take what I'm saying not as an absolute blueprint, but as something to think with in relation to your specific discipline, and perhaps also, of course, in conversation with your specific supervisor. So I think you've already had an introduction in terms of my broad research interests. But I think it is important to say that I'm trained actually in both in sociology and in anthropology. But I did my own PhD in social anthropology, and I now teach and work in the Department of Anthropology and Development Studies. So I'm quite interdisciplinary myself, and so can speak to at least some of the different issues some of you might be facing across disciplines. So I wanted to, I know this session was advertised from 10 to 12, but with the organizers, I agreed that we'd conclude by 11:30 because I have another commitment. So what I'm going to do, I personally like a more interactive style of a workshop. But given that we've had to shorten the session to an hour and a half, I'm going to try and get the content I wanted in the first 45 minutes to an hour, and then leave plenty of time, or at least some time, I hope, for you to raise your questions, your concerns, your challenges, etc. In the last session. So it's going to be less interactive than I would have liked. But I started just at the beginning asking everyone, and some of you might still be doing this, to just let me know, so I have a sense of who's in the room, right? How many of you are master's students? How many are PhD? How many of you are just beginning? How many of you are writing proposals and you joined the session because, you actually want to be well equipped for when you have to begin writing up the final dissertation. And if that's you, I think you've done a very wise thing by coming to this session. Some of you said you were just in the middle of your research. So, you maybe some months, maybe a year after the proposal, you're in the middle of, transcribing interviews or trying to organize your material, your documents that you're analyzing, or your archives, etc. And some of you are much closer to the end. One or two of you, I think someone in politics, political economy said, they're submitting next month. So the 31st of October deadline is looming for some of you. So I hope that some of today's lecture will still be, or workshop will still be useful for you. But of course, depending on where you are in the process, you will be able to take on some of the suggestions I'm making to a more or less a degree. So, those of you at the end, if there's some things I'm highlighting and you think, oh gosh, I didn't do that. I don't want to, cultivate any unnecessary panic. This is something, if you're really at the end phases, you should be, really trying to tidy up things. And it really is a question for you of formatting and making sure the document is clean, crisp. So some of what I'm going to be sharing today might be things that you've already had to think about. So depending on where you are, different components of what I'm sharing will be useful. And the third question I asked was, what discipline are you all coming from? So it seems we have a good mix of masters and PhD. We have a good mix of people at the beginning, the middle, and the end. And then at least some of the disciplines I noted here was we had quite a lot of people from media and communications. We had someone from social work, or two people from social work, some in development studies, so in my own department, linguistics, politics, and leadership. So quite diverse. So I think that's quite nice. And so I'm not going to say too much about the objectives, but rather just dig straight into how how we're going to move through this time we have together in the next 45 minutes. So I want to begin with some kind of very basics in terms of the thesis structure that is used by most disciplines in the humanities at UJ, and one or two comments on formatting. And then I want to move into what's more the meat of the presentation from my side, which is thinking about, how do you craft a strong introduction? How do you, some advice and thoughts on writing a literature review, some comments on the methods chapter, and then organizing and structuring what I'm calling the argument-driven findings chapters. So this is, different people's structure, as we'll see. structure the findings chapters in different ways. I'm going to show 2 theses in development studies that show that, yes, there needs to be a certain organization, but how you organize those chapters, in a sense, depends on the material you have, the data you've collected, and also disciplinary contextual factors. And then I want to kind of end by helping, especially for those of you right at the end of your PhD or master's journey, is thinking about, once you submit it, it goes to 2 reviewers or examiners. And so I think it's very helpful. So I, of course, am a supervisor to lots of students, but I'm also an examiner. So when I'm examining, what am I looking for? What makes a good thesis when you're examining it? And this, I think, can be very helpful to keep in your mind when you are, structuring your thesis, editing your thesis, making the final. And then, as I said, we will have time for all of your comments and questions at the end. So I hope everyone is okay with that style of workshop. Okay, so let's just kick straight off. So the first thing I wanted to really just dig into, most of you will know this, and this is why I didn't want to spend too much time on these basics, because you can't have, got yourself enrolled in a master's and PhD program and not know this. But here are the kind of key fundamentals. So, one of the big questions everyone has is, how long does a thesis need to be? And at least in my department, and I think this is true for others, but please feel free to correct me or raise this when we get to the end. But in development studies and in anthropology, which I'm more familiar with, a PhD thesis is expected to be around 80,000 words, which sounds like a lot, but when you break it down into 8 chapters and including references, you realize actually that 80,000 words gets eaten up very quickly. A master's thesis, for example, if you're doing a master's by dissertation or thesis only in our department, the thesis is expected to be around 40,000 words. So it's quite substantive. It's half of a PhD. But if you're doing a master's by coursework or a mini dissertation, because you're also doing master's level coursework, then this thesis often can be less. I think we don't offer this. Well, we offer a master's in social policy and development, and I think that is around 25,000 words. So those are the kind of word length figures that I imagine all of you are very familiar with. You know what you're working towards. And then the next kind of key question is thinking about, you can talk about the format of a thesis, but, the real critical thing is, what are the different components? What does a thesis need to include? What does a thesis look like in its final form? And one way, except I see I've put the wrong title for the second list. That should say, the main body of the thesis. So you'll see later on in my slides, I give 2 links to 2 different UJ PhD theses that show 2 examples of how people structure the main or the findings chapters differently. But all theses in UJ have to have very standardized front material. And I didn't go into this because I think it doesn't take much for you to click on the links of published PhD theses from our university and look at exactly what that involves. So if you are not already doing that, consulting published PhDs or master's theses in your discipline, I would highly recommend that you find students that were supervised by your supervisor, or you could ask your supervisor, what's been one of the best master's or PhD theses to come out of our department in the last 2 or 3 years. And this, in a way, can be a very helpful guide for you as you navigate writing up the thesis. But at a very generic level, if you look at a UJ thesis, you'll see that the first anywhere between 1 and 10 to 15 pages is what I would call front material. So this is the title page that says the title of your thesis, your name, who your supervisor is. Then there's a page which is you have to get a formal affidavit, which is declaring legally that this is your own independent work and that you haven't paid someone, for example, to write your thesis for you. So this is a very important and legally binding affidavit. Then you would usually have an abstract, which would be, a maximum 300 word summary of your thesis. Then you would have acknowledgements, which of course you don't have to do, but most people do, because a master's and a PhD is a long labor of love, often a painful one. And so all of us know that we don't get to the finishing line without many people helping us, from our supervisors to our loved ones, to our families, to our fellow, students. And so, that can also be sometimes if you're feeling a bit stuck with writing, sometimes writing something like the acknowledgements can be a nice breath of fresh air, something to, write that doesn't feel like the heavy thesis chapters. So do keep that in mind and don't keep it right to the end, because if you do really want to kind of honor the people who've helped you get to this point, you do want to make sure you don't just, scramble that at the last minute. Then you'll have a list of figures, tables, and illustrations or images. Of course, not all theses have these things. If you've done a lot of quantitative statistical work, you, of course, will have many, many, many tables. If, like myself, and you're a qualitative researcher and you mainly do interviews and participant observation, you might not have any figures or tables. So this really just depends on the type of data collection you do. But it is very critical to have those listed very neatly and orderly. And I recommend that you use the built-in features of Microsoft Word that automatically updates the listing. So if you delete one, what was 1.3, table 1.3 automatically becomes 1.2. And you can, if you're not very familiar with these tools in Microsoft Word, you can just Google how to do format tables in Microsoft Word, and there'll be lots of online YouTube videos, etc. And then there's two other key things under front material. The other one is a list of acronyms. So this is very, very important and very helpful if you're an examiner of a thesis, that when you see an acronym that you're not familiar with, you can quickly flip to the front of the thesis and see, what is being referred to. Something to just be, really when you're in the final stages and reading the thesis is just to be very, very sure that the first time you use, say, African National Congress, brackets ANC, that the first time you use that word or that phrase, you have the acronym in brackets next to it, and that you from then on use the acronym. So it's it's a bit messy to sometimes use the full expression and sometimes use the acronym. So proper usage has the list of acronyms at the beginning, and you only use the full form right in the first instance. And then the table of contents. And if you are not already using the different functionalities of Microsoft Word, where you use the automated heading features, I would recommend that you invest some time in learning how to use the different heading features in Microsoft Word, which then automatically generates a table of contents for you. Again, if you're not familiar with this, this is going to save you a huge amount of time. And you really just need to Google, how to generate a table of contents in Microsoft Word. And, I can't imagine my life without these automated tools to generate a table of contents. What that means is, if you add another 3 paragraphs to your conclusion, the table of contents can automatically update the page numbers on the front page that says the conclusion is from page 283 to 287, for example. So that is the front material, right? That's all the components of the beginning of the thesis, which are really just setting it up, right? The bulk of the thesis and the majority of the 80 or 40 or 25,000 words comes in the second list, which should be labeled main body of the thesis. So apologies for that mistake there. And nearly all humanities, master's and PhD theses are made up of these key components. So the first is an introduction, a strong introduction, which I'm going to talk about now. This is a absolutely important, critical part of a thesis. It's the first thing that an examiner reads, or anyone that reads your thesis. So if you can't, grab their attention or convince them of the importance of your research in that first few pages, it's hard for you to, do that later on. The second is your literature review section, and some disciplines also have a theoretical framework as a separate section, or sometimes included within it. That does depend to some extent on different disciplines. Then, of course, the methodology chapter, and then you have main chapters. And again, as I'll show with these example theses just now, some people just have one findings chapter. Other people have 2 or 3. And I'll show you just now how different people structure that. So that, again, depends on, if it's a master's, you might only have 1 findings chapter. If it's a PhD, you might have 2 or 3, but you structure those differently. And that how you structure them really depends on the kind of research you've done. And that is something where, I can't give absolute guidance. Rather, I'll give some overarching guide kind of framework to think about, but it will depend on your specific research and context. And then very important chapter is the conclusion. And often the introduction and the conclusion, students often don't take that seriously, but these are probably 2 of the, very, very important chapters. They're both how you're introducing the study and its significance at the beginning. And then right at the end, you're kind of synthesizing, bringing together all the different kind of components and making a kind of taking a final take on what this thesis has achieved, rather than, what it's setting out to do. And then, of course, you have a bibliography or reference list. Of course, this is critical, and again, something students often leave right to the end, where it can take many, many days, actually, especially if you're not using something like EndNote or Zotero, to fix up your reference list. And there's nothing that irritates an examiner more is than reading a thesis and you see a reference to, let's say, an article by Moyo and Vilakazi, and then you think, oh, that sounds interesting, and then you go looking for the reference at the end, and it's not there, or it's incomplete. So this is, again, something to make sure you give yourself that time at the end. And then appendices. Most theses in the social sciences or humanities will have appendices, including your ethics application, your questionnaire, your informed consent form, but sometimes, also examples of the documents you analyzed. So what you included in appendix also is something you should discuss with your supervisor. But your appendices do not normally count towards your word count. So that's something to keep in mind. And then, I wanted to just say that, of course, a PhD or a master's thesis in the humanities is quite different from one in, commerce or in the, in the medical field. And at least I believe that one of the things that distinguishes a thesis in the humanities is the 3 things I've put in red text there. So a humanities thesis emphasizes kind of narrative. There's some element of a thesis, even though it's written in academic language. You're telling a story. You're inviting me in to understand something that we don't know that much about, or we need to know more about. You then set out how you went about acquiring this new knowledge. So that would be questions of method. And then what did you find out? And you tell what you found out in a way that ideally is captivating and interesting. So there's an element of narrative. Secondly, you can't have a thesis. The definition of the word thesis is argument. So you can't have a thesis without an argument, an overarching thesis, an overarching argument, which is the contribution you're making through that thesis. But of course, each component of the thesis, so each chapter needs to, in a sense, contribute to that overarching argument. And so it can be useful to think about, what is the argument of each chapter, or even of each section of each chapter. And then, of course, critical analysis. What, makes us humanities scholars or social scientists is that we have learned the art of critical thinking and critical analysis. And our theses are where we get to show that off in a way. And so, a thesis by definition involves critical analysis of the existing literature, of our fieldwork or our research, and of course of our own contribution. So I hope that has the basics covered. As I said, I didn't want to spend this, precious time we have together to talk about, what size the margin should be, and what font size to use, and because I think this is very self-explanatory. And I think if most of you go and look at example theses in your discipline, they're all on the UJ website. You can access them freely through a Creative Commons license. So I'll show you 2 links. They, are very good examples of, the front material. So this list on the left-hand side, what exactly those need to look like. But of course, you want to make sure that you consistently, so the margin, I think it's 2.54, that is on either side of a Word document, which is the standard template, is fine for a UJ thesis. But you do want to make sure that you are consistent with your font size, your line spacing. Again, there's nothing worse than a thesis that uses different fonts in different parts of the thesis. So the overarching guide here is to be consistent with what you use. And of course, to make sure you use page numbers. As I said earlier, I really recommend that you use Microsoft Word effectively. And so to use their different heading styles. So the main heading, for example, chapter 1, then you might have subheadings and then subheadings, and to use the automated subheadings and headings that come with Microsoft Word. Because if you use those right from the beginning, you will be able to automatically generate a table of contents, and that will automatically update itself. So I assume many of you are already doing these things, but if you are unfamiliar with them, I would definitely take the time to watch some YouTube videos on Microsoft Word formatting, and to, that will be an investment that is, really worth your time. I'm sure you've all had it drilled into you, the importance of proper citation and referencing. So UJ seems to, across the board, require a Harvard citation style. So that's where you have the author and the date in brackets, and then the full reference at the end in the reference list in the Harvard style. And so, there's a UJ Harvard citation guide, which I'm sure the organizers of this workshop can share with all of you if you don't already have it. But again, the main thing is to just make sure that you're consistently using the Harvard citation style. And I would also highly recommend that if you're not already using, it can be a bit overwhelming at the beginning, and I remember feeling overwhelmed, 8, 9, 10 years ago when I first started using Zotero, probably now about 12 years ago, actually. But, I thank myself every day that I spent the time learning how to use one of these reference management softwares. It saves you a huge amount of time. And then the last thing is that you should try and limit the number of footnotes or endnotes, although this can be different. I know, for example, in history and philosophy, they often use footnotes or endnotes a little bit more because of the kind of text that they're using. So, of course, defer to your discipline on this kind of matter directly. And then I think I spoke earlier about tables, figures, and illustrations, but again, just be consistent with the captioning and the formatting of those elements within the thesis. Okay, so let's move on to the more meaty and I think more interesting stuff. So, critically important. Many of you often a strong introduction, or an introduction is often the last chapter you write. Actually, it's recommended that you write the introduction once you've already written, the findings chapters, the discussion chapter, the methods chapter. You then, in a way, you can't really write a good introduction unless you've finished all the other chapters. And this is when you present it kind of upfront. So while the introduction chapter is critical, is because, like I said, it's the first chapter that your supervisor, when you send them the final version, but also it's the first thing that the examiner, which is your second main reader beyond your supervisor, it's the first thing that they read. It's the first thing they encounter, and so it gives them a sense of this thesis. What is this thesis about? And ideally, you want your examiner to enjoy reading your thesis. And so keep them in your mind, keep your reader in mind when you write your introduction. And so there's an article, which I actually forgot to put on in the reference list at the end of the presentation, by Swales and Feek in 2004. And they're talking here about an introduction for a journal article, but the same principles apply to a thesis introduction. So they say an introduction for a journal article, but also for a chapter in a thesis, should have 3 moves, what they call moves. And this means you have to do 3 key things. So these are them. The first is to establish the research territory, right? And what I mean is kind of where is your project situated in the wider literature? So you need to, show what research already exists. You need to highlight, why it's important, why it's interesting, or why it's, also understudied, and provide just some short summary, right? You're not trying to condense your whole literature review here, but you're trying to just establish why this is not just important, your topic is not just important for society, but it's also important in terms of the academic knowledge or the academic scholarship. The second point is to establish a niche, or what some people would call a gap. I'm sure this is something all of you have thought a lot about. And so right in the introduction, you want to set up the project by saying, my project is connected to this bigger set of debates or literature and this important social issue or whatever it is. But the existing literature has mainly done X or Y, and it hasn't done Z, which is, what my study seeks to do. Or you can say we've had a lot of X or Y, but it's, we need more studies that look at X. And so the second bullet point under 2 there is that your project can, instead of filling a gap, it can actually extend or build upon prior knowledge. So, it can say, my study is trying to do something quite similar to this study, but it's doing it in a different location or with a different demographic of people, for example. So you need to establish the research territory or terrain, establish your niche or gap, and then occupy that niche. So in the introduction, you need to come across quite confident with the way you write. Define, this is the objective of my study. This is what it's set out to do. These were the questions it wanted to set out to answer. And in the introduction, a good introduction gives a hint of the final kind of thesis, the final argument. So it states the principle and all the main findings and contributions. So it kind of, which is, if you read a good journal article in the introduction tells you what the argument of the whole paper is. And then you read the next few sections to get the details. And a thesis should work exactly the same way. So you state what your primary contribution is right at the beginning. And then you start to unpack how you got there with the methods, and what that contribution is in terms of the data you collected. So then just getting very specific, thinking about, formatting or the structure of an introduction. So my suggestion would be that you have a very clear introductory paragraph that needs to grab the reader's attention. It needs to state the purpose of the chapter. So, what are you trying to achieve in the introduction? And importantly, it needs to provide a roadmap. So, for example, describing what the introduction chapter is going to cover. And this is something you'll see for all the chapters in a good thesis. You state the purpose of the chapter, and then you provide this kind of roadmap that outlines, exactly what is included. So the reader is not left guessing. A good thesis is one where you make me feel, as the examiner, very secure as to the journey we're on. Where are we going? How is this section connected to the next section, etc., etc. So you'll have an introductory paragraph. Most introductions or introductory chapters will also have some kind of background section where you contextualize the research problem and you underscore its relevance within broader scholarly debate. So, why does your topic matter? Why does your project matter? Thirdly, you provide a very short summary, a very brief overview of the research design and methodology. So all the detail comes in the methods chapter, but you do want to just hint at that right at the beginning. And then the most important thing with the concluding section of an introduction chapter is to provide an outline of the chapters that come. So you say, in chapter 2, I outline the literature review and I look at A, B, C, D. I then discuss my methodological approach and my methods of data collection in chapter 3. And in chapter 4, 5, and 6, if it's a PhD, for example, I look at the main results and discuss them. And you can, say a little bit more about that. So I think that's, sorry, I'm looking at the time. So if everyone is okay, maybe our facilitator can jump in if you think I need to break, but I'd like to keep going and then have more time at the end. So that was covering, these last two slides were covering the important first main body section, which was the introduction. And next you have the literature review section, which is often or the literature review chapter, which is often a chapter that people struggle with quite a lot, both in writing the proposal, but also in writing the final thesis. So I think it's helpful to think always, what is the purpose of this chapter? So when you're, some of you are right at the end, right? Go back to your document and think, okay, what is the purpose of this chapter, and have I achieved that? Right? Or if you're starting out, sometimes it can be even useful to write at the top of your document, the purpose of this chapter is to do X and Y, and I want to structure it like this, as a kind of guide to yourself. And then you can use that to populate the section. I personally recommend that you work in different Word documents for these different sections or different chapters until right at the end. I think working on one huge document can be a bit overwhelming. So sometimes it can be useful to have separate documents for the separate chapters and only bring them into one document when you're, right towards the end. So what is the purpose of a literature chapter? I called it a section here, but I mean a chapter. All of you will know this. It's to establish the scholarly significance of your research, but also to identify gaps, to assess the previous studies that have been done that are related to your topic. And for some disciplines, but not all, it's to outline your conceptual or theoretical framework. This is, again, just an important point to make, is that writing a literature review is a process. And by that I mean it's iterative. It's an irritating process sometimes, because it's not a straight line. You read a few documents and these change how you think about your own research in the proposal phase. And when you've finished the research and you're writing up the final document, the same is true. You go back to the literature. Sometimes you have to read new literature because you found new things through your data collection. And the process of reading the literature, in a sense, is constantly in this dialogue with your project. And so you're finding new things, you're finding other research that helps you interpret your own research better. It helps sharpen your own argument. And so, I think it's useful to think about the literature review chapter not just as this tick box, something you need to do, read X number of articles and summarize them, but the process of engaging with the literature should be central to you being able to articulate a strong argument in your thesis. And then, of course, there's the question of how to organize a literature review. And this really depends on your specific discipline and project, but a few things I think are true of most literature review chapters. So you want to, like all chapters, begin with a clear introduction that states the purpose of this chapter and provides that roadmap. It outlines the structure of that chapter. And then there's the difficult question, and I see a lot of my students struggle with this. How do we struggle the main body of the literature? Do we structure it thematically? Do we structure it chronologically, looking at debates, that changed over time, looking at different decades of debates on how something was understood? Do we look at different author perspectives, or, scholars that have one ideological perspective or one theoretical perspective versus scholars with a different theoretical perspective? And all of these are decisions that you have to make depending on your research aims and objectives, and of course in relation to your supervisor. But no matter how you structure that main section of your literature review, you do need to always be attending to, what are the gaps in this existing literature, in these debates, that makes your project significant. And so the relationship between that niche or that gap and the uniqueness of your project is something you want to be thinking about through every single section in the literature review. That should be very, very clear. And of course, you want to conclude the literature review chapter, with summarizing the main points and always relating it back to your particular project, its aims and its objectives, while also signposting or saying, and now in the next chapter, we're going to do X or Y. So these are some of the kind of common mistakes or pitfalls I see people doing, especially graduate students doing with literature, the literature review chapter. And the one is what I call the laundry list approach, which is basically, just you want to list every single reading you've ever read for your project. And this does not make a good literature review. A good literature review is actually an analytical document. It shows your ability to synthesize readings and literature in a very organized, logical way. And so, in a sense, you structure the literature review to make an argument, to tell part of the story which you're telling as you move through the thesis from one chapter to the next. So you want to avoid this kind of laundry list approach of just listing all the literature you've read. And the other common mistake or pitfall I see people make is to kind of, you have the introduction, then you have the literature, and you just talk about the literature without connecting it to your project, without being in discussion with the literature to show how your project emerges out of these debates or out of this niche or this gap that you've referred to. So here I had this question for you, but I'm going to ask that you think about it and raise it at the end if you have any specific questions around the specific challenges you've had with or any of these elements of structuring a thesis. Okay, and then the other thing I wanted to talk about is, often one of the other mistakes I see students making with the methods chapter is they think they can just copy and paste what was in the proposal into the methods chapter for the final thesis. And this absolutely cannot work, and for a few reasons. One, when you write the proposal, you write it in the kind of present tense, or saying that this is something you're going to do, right? You're hoping to interview X number of people, do X focus groups. You foresee that the ethical, difficulties you might encounter are X or Y. But when you're writing a final methods chapter in a thesis, you actually are narrating what has happened. So you're writing it in the past tense. And as many of you will know that are in the end phases of a thesis, what you wanted to do is not necessarily what you did. Or, we all encounter lots and lots of problems and challenges when we do our research. And so, as I wrote on the slide there, for me, a good way of thinking about the task of writing a methodological chapter is to see it as an account of all the research decisions you made. but also very importantly, an explanation of why you made them. So it's kind of quite a reflective. In the humanities, a good methods chapter is not just reflective on your positionality, how your gender, race, etc., has shaped the research process. It's also reflective on the whole research process, what you set out to do, what you actually did, and how it went. You know, was your initial strategy of data collection actually, did that work out in practice, or did you have to make some changes, which is often something that happens to many of us in our graduate degrees. So, you know, you need to, for example, show and reflect on how and why you decided on your research question. You need to reflect on how and why you decided on your research design. So why this data collection tool? You actually need to reflect on the actual collection of the data. How did that process go? You know, if you set out to interview equal numbers of women and men, but actually in practice it was very difficult to talk to women, why then did your study become a study that focused just on men? Or, you know, you faced linguistic barriers or etc., whatever. So reflecting on this in a very open, honest way is a very important part of a methods chapter. And the same is true for how you analyzed your data, reflecting on how you analyzed it, but also why you analyzed it thematically or in whatever way you did. So as I said, for the earlier chapters, you know, important here is to outline the purpose of your methods chapter. And I would say at the most generic level, the purpose of a methods chapter is to explain your research approach. So why this methodological approach and not others, right? Why is this an exploratory study? And making that very, very clear to the reader as one example. And then, as I said, with the earlier chapters, you need a very clear introduction paragraph where you outline the purpose of the chapter, you provide a roadmap, but also something sometimes that gets left off is identify the unit of analysis. So is the analysis individuals? Is the analysis households? Is the analysis organizations? Is the analysis, you know, whatever it is? That's something that should be very clear right from the beginning. And then you need to provide a brief description of your data collection methods. So did you use interviews? Did you use document analysis? Did you do observations, etc.? As well as, you know, where did you conduct the study? So some people will have a separate section on the study site with some background information on, you know, the particular community or if you're doing research based on two organizations, you will provide some contextual or background information on those organizations, as well as how you selected the participants, so the kind of sampling. So a lot of this is in a proposal, but it's written in a format that is not, you know, not necessarily, it's not written in this kind of reflective past tense form. But also many things could have changed from when you wrote your proposal to writing the final methods chapter. And of course, lastly, you need to describe how you analyzed your data. And then a few other things that you need to include. Most humanities dissertations need to have some discussion on, you know, on validity and trustworthiness. So how can you kind of show or prove to the reader that this study is trustworthy. So sometimes this is by describing that you used multiple means of data collection, or you did member checks. You know, you went back to the people you interviewed and explained how you'd analyzed the data and asked for their feedback. So there's different ways you can do that. The key thing is to be as specific as you can, but be brief. You know, you don't want to spend all your 40,000 words on a methods chapter. You want the methods chapter to be fairly short, you know, with a master's, maybe 8, maximum 10,000 words, but really probably even 7 to 8 is sufficient. So you have to say a lot of things, but you have to do that in this very kind of structured, brief way. And then a lot of methods chapters also have sections that look at ethical considerations, your positionality or how you shape the research process, and also some discussion on limitations. But again, that does depend on the discipline, if that is necessary or something that might not be in all cases. Okay, and then the hardest section of a thesis to provide clear guidance on the format of is the findings chapters, or what I call the argument-driven chapters, that are reflecting and writing up your findings. Because how you write or structure your findings chapters, or one chapter, especially if you're doing a master's, really depends on your study. And so I think you'll get these slides, or I can pop these links in the chat as soon as I stop talking. But these are two PhD theses in development studies that I am both very familiar with. They're connected to my own research, so they were easy for me to share. And the first one is by someone called Lauren Stewart, which is looking at public employment programs in Orange Farm in South Africa. And if you click on that link and you just use it to look at the first few pages, the front material, as I was talking about earlier, it's useful for that. But importantly, I wanted to show you how she structures the findings chapters. So she has kind of 3 findings discussion chapters. She has her chapter 4. She breaks up into what she calls different case studies. So she evaluated or did research on I think it was 4 or 5 different public employment programs. And so she, in a way, before she can provide an overarching analysis of the findings on people's perspectives and experiences of public employment, she has to unpack these 4 different case studies, because her project was a kind of multiple case study comparative analysis. So she's looking at different public employment programs together. So she has one findings chapter that goes into detail on the 4 case studies. Then she has a chapter, which is chapter 5, where she discusses the different, what she calls community perspectives on public employment programs, that has many different subsections, which are her main themes, you could say, once she coded her interviews. And then she has a 6th chapter where she synthesizes the main findings, bringing together the discussion on the different case studies and the material in chapter 5 to make a number of significant findings and conclusions. And so that her chapter 6 has lots of different subsections that bring what's in chapter 4 and chapter 5 into discussion. So this is one way to do it, right? And makes sense because she had these different case studies. Whereas another, what I think is an excellent thesis by Mbuso Moyo, titled Youth Unemployment in the Royal Bafokeng Nation, takes a slightly different approach. So he has, instead of having these different case studies, he has chapter 5 is titled Royal Bafokeng Nation in Contact. So he has a whole findings chapter on Royal Bafokeng, not on its history, on its current operation, that provides, material that came from his research to provide this very important context. And then this is followed by chapter 6, which looks at young people's experiences, their aspirations, and their perceptions of unemployment. And this is also structured into different thematic areas. And when you look on the link, which I'll post soon, you'll get an idea of how his is kind of similar, but slightly different to how Lauren Graham, in the first example, organized her thesis. So what I really want to suggest is that if you have not already found 1, 2, or 3, or 4 excellent master's or PhD theses in your discipline, that you do that. They're all available on the UJ website, or you could even look at a different university. You could look at a thesis from another South African university. But looking at a UJ thesis can be very useful to make sure that the formatting issues, which I was talking about right at the beginning, are the same ones you will be expected to use. And I'm coming now towards the end. I see we're nearly at 11 o'clock. So just some broad guidelines on how to organize and structure these argument-driven findings chapters. Because I think it's very, very important. As I said, the definition of a thesis is that it has an argument. itself. It makes a contribution. But each component of the thesis, each chapter within it, in a sense, needs to have an argument of its own. So, as I say in that second sentence, the chapters, the different chapters, should be structured to build and develop the overall thesis argument, ensuring that the central argument remains the focal point throughout. And this is very hard to do, and this is why writing up a thesis takes as long as it does. As I've said, it's important to begin each chapter by outlining its purpose and how it contributes to the broader argument, and to use subsections to organize key points and evidence, but maintaining a logical progression of ideas. So if you look at Mbuso and Lauren's PhD theses, it can be helpful to see how they, in all of their chapters, but especially the findings chapters, how they structured it into subsections and then subsections, all of which are trying to build a logical progression of ideas to make an argument. And then equally important is, not just having a clear argument for each chapter or even each section, is to make sure that you build in effective transitions. So all the way through this talk, I've been talking about the importance of a roadmap. At the beginning of each chapter, you say this chapter is going to do this first, then this, then this, then this, then this. So I have a sense of you taking my hand through the thesis. But of course, when you get to the end of a section or the end of a chapter, you want to state what is coming next and how is it linked to what I've just discussed. And so this is what we call signposting or effective transitions, which are, very, very important to a good, well-structured thesis. And this is where I basically wanted to end, which was, what are examiners looking for? When they read your thesis, what in their mind makes a good thesis? And so these are just a few points that come from an article where they actually interviewed examiners and asked examiners what they look for. So examiners, you might be surprised, but we actually want to enjoy and understand a thesis. We do the work of examining, out of the goodness of our hearts, in a sense, or out of obligation to, having graduate students produce really good MAs and PhDs, but we want to enjoy it. We want to understand it. So the advice is to make the thesis reader friendly rather than hard work. Hence, organize it well. Make sure it's a clean document that's well structured, but also make sure that it's convincing. It's an accessible academic text. It shouldn't be lost in flowery academic jargon. You should be able to get your mother or father or someone who hasn't studied your discipline to read it and be able to at least understand the large majority of it. That's actually a good thesis, one that is easy to understand rather than one that it doesn't feel that way. Secondly, an examiner wants some sort of continuity or flow from point to point, section to section, and chapter to chapter. So this comes back to the importance of really structuring your thesis, structuring each chapter really, really well. And I would suggest that you aim to have a golden thread that runs through the thesis, that links it all together to one coherent whole. As I've said now repeatedly, to be consistent with your font sizes, with your with all the formatting issues we spoke about right at the beginning, but also be consistent with the terms you use. So if you use, the term habitus, Bourdieu's idea of habitus, or if you use the idea of racial capitalism, then use that idea, that concept throughout the thesis. Don't chop and change the concepts you're using, especially when you're using them interchangeably. This, again, can be very confusing to the reader. So be consistent with the terms and concepts you're using, but also the meanings you give them. And really make sure that sometimes we set out in our research journeys with a set of research questions that we want to answer. And then we do the research. And then there's this question of, has the research I've collected, the data I've collected, does it answer the research question? Or does it actually answer a question that's slightly different? And so sometimes with my own students, we have to reevaluate if the research question we started with is the question that they've answered? Or do we actually need to slightly revise the research question? So just make sure that the research question you outline in the introduction and where you end in the findings and the conclusion actually speak to each other. And then I wanted to just talk about common challenges. I think lots of students experience challenges of time management and setting milestones, dealing with writer's block. I'm sure you all have your own experiences of these. And of course, getting and incorporating feedback from supervisors, from peers that you might ask to read chapters. But I think I'm going to leave these up and rather let you ask questions, and I can always come back to those common challenges at the end. But I want to make sure that the next 25 minutes you can all raise your questions. So yeah, over to you. Sorry for speaking for so long.
Okay. Thank you so much again, Dr. Hannah, for the very insightful presentation, on thesis format and submission procedure. So there is questions in the chat box. I don't know if I can read it out. I can read them out to you, then you can answer them bit by bit. And if any other person has a question, then they can raise their hands. Then we can proceed just like that.
Yes, that's fine. I'm just getting some water. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So the first question here that I see is somebody, I think he was asking from the beginning. So it said, so the 80,000 words includes the entire thesis and not only the content, which is the body of the thesis.
Okay. Are we going to take them one by one?
Can I read them out to you, or you want to take them one by one? I don't know which is more convenient for you.
Yeah, well, I think let's take the simple ones one by one. So so in my department, the 80,000 words is all inclusive, as I understand it. But I would just double check with your PhD or master's coordinator in your department.
Okay, so there's the same question also saying that the word count include the front material, content material, references, and appendix. And does the thesis by article have the same structure with this one as well?
Yes, okay, interesting. So so I really think on this you are well placed to get clarity from your own PhD and master's coordinators. My understanding is that the word limit normally includes all the front material but excludes the appendices. But I'm also fairly new to UJ, and I know there sometimes can be disciplinary slight differences or adjustments. So please, don't take my word as any golden rule. You really need to get clarity from your discipline, your departments, especially the specific MA and PhD coordinators. This is an easy thing for them to answer. And on the thesis by article, this is, of course, becoming more common, this approach to writing a thesis. But none of what I've said applies to well, you know what I mean? It's a completely different format for a thesis. And I will just be honest and say, in my department, we do not offer the thesis by article format, at least yet. And so I actually can't provide any guidance on that. It might be something for the RCD's team is to actually have a special session on that because I can't speak to that, unfortunately.
Okay, this was sort of question says, is it okay if I have an individual reference list for every chapter? I've been doing that so I'm not overwhelmed when putting one together at the end of the whole thesis.
Yes, I think that's a fine. I mean, honestly, writing a master's and a PhD is a very stressful endeavor. So you should do whatever helps you. And so, as I suggested, I personally recommend that my students break up work on these sections individually, precisely because I think it makes the process less overwhelming. And so, by definition, when students are sending me just their methods chapter, it has a separate reference list at the end. And only when they bring it all together, once I've provided feedback on every chapter separately, then there's a final reference list. So I think that, of course, different supervisors work differently and all of that. But I think rather keep up a good reference list for each chapter. What you don't want is to not put a reference list together right at the beginning for each different section. And then you get to the end and you can't find the journal article or the book chapter that you've cited. That creates an absolute havoc. So, how you do it, in a sense, depends on what works best for you. But that approach makes sense to me personally. Yeah.
I see somebody asked about the submission process and the Viva workshop. So we're actually running a current series of Viva workshops. So you can also look that up on our model communities, because we have been running them since last week. So you can register and join. There is a session today at 1, I think, also for the Viva workshop as well. So for those that were asking about the Viva workshop, we are actually running a series of those workshops. So please look out on our model communities as well to attend those workshops. And I see another question here. Dr. Say, could you please provide a quick summary of what you have mentioned concerning acronyms? And please clarify the assessment procedure from submission of the final thesis.
Okay, so the first thing on acronyms, I was just saying that one of the important things to include in the front material of a thesis is a list of every acronym. So you need to go through your thesis, sentence by sentence, and check that you have included every single acronym you use. So I gave the example of African National Congress earlier, so ANC, but of course, you could have many, many different acronyms. So one, to make sure that it's listed in the front material in a very clear table or format. The second thing is to make sure that you consistently use the acronym in the text the first time you use African National Congress. So let's say you're describing something about the wider political context in your introduction chapter, and you say the ANC, the African National Congress brackets ANC came to power in da 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 da. So, but once you've used that acronym once in a thesis, you then, from then onwards, only need to use the acronym. So we shouldn't then see African National Congress again. From that first mention of it, we should just have ANC all the way through. So that's all I was saying about acronyms. It's one of those kind of final checks you do at the end, just to make sure you've got a clean, well organized, easily readable thesis. Oh, and then this question of clarify the assessment procedure from submission of the final thesis. Of course, this depends on master's and PhD, but some of it is the same. So, the first thing is to, have sent the first, got your supervisor's approval that this thesis in its current form is completely up to scratch. You might have also got some assistance with some, final editing of it, etc. But once you have the go-ahead, then it gets sent to the faculty using the one-stop form that you will have all filled out now, along with a few other key documents. So one is, this is true for master's and PhD. I just had it's got to go, you've got to get a Turnitin kind of report that, shows that you haven't plagiarized, or that there's not huge chunks of text which are not just copied without sufficient referencing, etc. And so basically your supervisor is responsible for submitting the final thesis with the one-stop form and a few other documents that include the Turnitin report to the faculty. And that form is submitted alongside with a form where the two examiners get appointed. This is true for masters and for PhD, although I think for PhD it's also two, but one of them has to be international. One of them has to be an international scholar somewhere else in the world. And that process of examination can take anywhere between 1, 3, sometimes 6 months. Unfortunately, we try to get the examination process complete within 3 months, but because academics are volunteering their time to be examiners, we sometimes have to wait longer than we would like for the examination process to happen. So with masters, you get written reviewer comments or examination comments. And they'll, say if this thesis needs minor revisions, major revisions. So, how much work you have to do after you've submitted it depends on the examiner's feedback. In a very few circumstances, an examiner will pass a thesis with no corrections. They'll basically say the thesis is absolutely perfect. This is normally a case in which you've got a distinction, um, um, not just this distinction, a very good distinction, but this happens next to none of the time. So that's another thing for you to keep in mind, is that there's a delay between the submission process and getting the examination reports if you're doing a master's, or with a PhD, as someone was asking about the Viva process, which I'm not going to go into detail here, but the Viva is organized. There's a NAC, someone in your department who will organize a meeting between the two examiners and yourself. And this is an opportunity where you get to, often people are very nervous or very scared about this, but it's really an opportunity to talk about your thesis. And at the PhD level, a PhD is really what's the word I want? It's the thing that ushers you in to being a scholar in a very serious sense. And so part of that process is you being able to articulate yourself in your own words and discuss your own thesis. And it should be, if you're confident in your own work, it should even be an enjoyable experience, even though it's an actual oral exam. You're being tested on the knowledge that is in there and wanting to be seen how you discuss it, if you can discuss it in a kind of critical manner. So, of course, so with a master's, you're waiting for the examination reports. With the Viva, you have the written reports, but you also have the oral exam. And based on those examiner reports or the Viva, the examiners will outline, have they accepted the thesis with no corrections? Are minor corrections needed? Are major corrections needed? And based on the examiner's feedback, you will then work with your supervisor closely to make sure that you make those necessary changes before you submit a final version. And the final version that you submit needs to be signed off by your supervisor. And that will be the version that eventually ends up in the UJ online repository. And only once all of those steps are done can you graduate. So, I think often we have a huge sigh of relief, and you should celebrate once you submit the final version. But there are still many other steps that you have to move through post-submission, if that makes sense. So I hope that clarifies that. And again, I would really recommend that you ask your departmental PhD and master's coordinators, if there's a few of you in your department and you want more information about this process, that you ask them to organize a short, meeting or online session to clarify. I know our department, we're very happy to do that kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay, so Doc, there was a hand raised by Maria Rosa. I don't know if you still have a question. You may unmute and you may speak.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear her, Doc?
Hello? Good morning.
Hi, Maria.
Hi, yeah, I just had two questions. One was like you mentioned, once we start doing our research, maybe we fine-tune our original question, because once you're out in the field, you decide, that maybe this other thing might be a little bit more interesting, not completely changing, but you change your kind of focus on how you're looking at things. So when you're writing it up, you have to say that you change that, or you just like change what you decide to look at when you're in your introduction, you're saying, okay, my question was this, but it's your new question based on what you actually decided that you were going to look at once you were there? Or do you have to say, when I wrote my proposal, I thought this, but I was going to look at this, but now then I went into that?
Yeah, so in a sense, I think, ultimately you should discuss this kind of thing with your supervisor. But my general feedback would be it in a sense depends on how much the question is changing, right? Sometimes it's, you said, young men and women, and actually it became women. That's the kind of thing I think you could just state the changed question in the introduction, and then in the methodology section reflect on why you made that change. But you could limit it in the introduction. You don't need to necessarily unpack that in the introduction, but it is the kind of thing you should unpack in the methodology section, just in a couple sentences. But there might be an instance where, you had to, for example, for geopolitical reasons, you did, some of your field work and what you were just beginning, and for, reasons completely out of your control, you had to change locations. And that might be something that you want to state up front in the thesis, because it really shaped the trajectory that the project took. So that would be like a much larger, more significant change. Okay. So, it's kind of contextually dependent. But I do think it's something often people don't want to talk about. It's like, well, this is what I said I was going to do in my proposal, and so this is, but it's true. I think those of us that have been doing research for a long time, that the research process in and of itself does require us to be attentive to shifts in our assumptions about things, but also to the research questions we're answering. So I would just rather keep that in your mind and discuss it with your supervisor as you go along.
Okay. My other question was, like, I'm my PhD is in anthropology, and
Okay.
so obviously I have a lot of data, like interviews, surveys, and field notes from observations. So do we put a lot of that, like, as life stories and stuff, as an annex? Do we put a whole chapter about all this that we were, like, all our information, or we just pull out the bits that we're going to use for our arguments and analysis, and none of what, like, the core of what we describe, that doesn't go into the thesis?
Yeah, so I mean, of course, if I was giving this whole talk just to anthropology students, myself having written a PhD in anthropology, I would have, here I was giving quite generic guidelines that could be relatable to people in very different kinds of disciplines who also do, different types of field work. But specifically to anthropology, again, there's, if you look at anthropological theses, you'll see also quite the differences in how people write up the findings chapter. But the one thing anthropology allows is that kind of storytelling narrative in which, yes, I don't think you would normally have your field note journals as an appendices, or your large volumes of transcriptions from conversations or interviews. Rather, you need to, and in anthropology, normally you would have, at the PhD level, in my experience, you would have 2, 3, sometimes even 4 thematically organized findings chapters that are written in a narrative in which the ethnographic context, the observational data from your field notes is written into a narrative that then incorporates observations, interviews into very much a kind of narrative style of writing up findings. Whereas if someone is in a discipline like sociology or politics and just did interviews, often that requires a different style of writing up the findings chapter, which is more aligned to the 2 theses. Oh, let me share those links now, that I shared, which are a little bit different. So, I think it sounds like the challenge for you, and I can speak to your, discipline more specifically here, is what you want to be doing as you move into the analysis, to think about how the different sources of data you have, what of those you want to draw together to build a set of sub-arguments, a set of thematically organized narratives that build the arc of the thesis as a whole. And how you draw upon those different sources of data, in a sense, is the creative part of the writing up process. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, thank you.
So the links to the two theses I was using as examples for development studies are there. So I recommend you click on those and have a look at them, both for the front material, but also how people organize the thesis.
Yeah, there is another question, Doc. So the question says, when writing the findings chapter, is it acceptable or recommended to substantiate the findings with literature? And can you expand on how one can identify gaps for his study when writing the literature review?
Okay, so the first question was, in the findings chapter, if I understood the question,
Yeah,
can I include, or to what extent do I bring in discussion of the literature into that section?
I think so, yes, that.
Yeah, so of course, we've just earlier in your thesis had the substantively organized literature review chapter, right? So that's where the bulk of the literature is. But of course, a thesis is being evaluated on the contribution you are making through your research to these existing debates. And so there shouldn't be paragraphs of other people's writing, other scholarly literature in the findings section. And yet, at the same time, you do want to show how your findings are similar or different to other studies, or how your study, challenges or complicates what someone else found 3 years earlier or in a different location. So it's, again, it's not something I can say. It really depends on the story you're telling, on the argument you're building. But yes, a findings chapter normally would include some literature, but in this very specific way that I'm describing, because you're using the literature to show exactly what your contribution is, how your study says something similar or different, or challenges this idea, or confirms this other person's scholarship or work. And then the question of, how to develop a gap in the literature, this is we have to conclude this in a few minutes, and that, requires a whole workshop in and of itself. But I did include at the end of my slide, there's a woman called Cecile, let me get her surname right, Cecile Badenhorst, who does these really fantastic YouTube videos, which I always recommend to my students. And some of her ideas I've used in what I presented today. And she has a number of videos looking just at literature reviews. And I'll post that in the chat now, but I would recommend you look at all of her videos, especially around writing literature reviews. It's very, very good work. Any last questions?
Is it possible if you can just also post your email address, rather, if maybe students have questions, they can email you if that's possible with you, Dr. Hannah, if that's fine with you.
Yes, it is, but I would prefer not to have hundreds of emails. I've got my own students. But because I really think that, it's important that you go to your departments for specific guidance, and your supervisors, So that's actually, I'm a little bit hesitant to say, come to me for specific questions and guidance, because I'm most likely going to recommend that you speak with your supervisor, or speak to the coordinator within your department on anything to do with format and submission. There's only so much I can provide at a generic humanities-wide level. So I'm not going to put my email here, but you'll find me on the UJ website. If you really want to reach out, you are welcome to do so.
Yeah, because I see a lot of questions as well regarding the format and how to structure the thesis. So I don't know if it's rather possible if they can consult that with their supervisor, as you said. I think that would be fine as well, because obviously it differs from department to department, as you mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. And even this thing of, how to use Microsoft Word, all I can recommend on that is it sounds simple maybe, but Google it. And I honestly recommend, sometimes YouTube videos are a huge, huge resource. If you're not familiar with Word's functionality, simply put into Google how to use Microsoft Word's heading and styles and watch that video and then experiment on your own. If you email me and ask me how to do that, I can't explain it in an email. It's something you actually have to experiment with yourself. Or, you know, get 2 or 3 friends together that are all doing PhDs and say, how do you use Word? How do you use Word? And experiment together. This is something that, in a sense, you have to practice doing, rather than it's something I can outline, you know, in terms of basic principles. But it will, if you do invest in that time, it will absolutely serve you. It will make your life a lot easier. So, and this is the first time I've given this workshop myself. So I know there was the link for feedback on how the session was, but I personally would actually be interested to know what was helpful, what was not. Were you expecting things that I didn't cover? So I wasn't given a huge amount of guidance. So I've covered what, in my experience, I think students struggle with. So yes, I leave it there. Thanks for everyone for coming. I'm afraid I am going to have to log off in any minute, in a minute or two.
Okay. Thank you so much again, Dr. Hannah. You know, just a pity that now you have to run. And also for the students, thank you so much, you know, for taking your time to be here and to listen to Dr. Hannah, our facilitator for today's workshop. And would like to once again express our gratitude here at the RCD unit, and for your hard work and for your efforts and for taking your time. And thank you so much again, Dr. Hannah. Hope to work with you again in the future. And we really, 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 really appreciate your insights on this thesis format and submission procedure workshop. And thank you again to every participant. And please kindly note that I have posted the feedback survey. Then obviously we will share with you that Dr. Hannah, the attendance and all the feedback surveys. And also please to kindly just share with us the presentation so that we may share it with the student on the model communities. Thank you again. And I think with that, if there's nothing more that you like to say, we may close off the session. Dr. Hannah.
Yeah, great. Thanks. And best of luck to you all. I'm sure you will succeed, but yeah, it's hard to getting, especially to those of you at the end. So yeah, best of luck and keep at it. Okay. Cheers. Bye.
Okay. Thank you so much, Doc. Thank you. Bye. Enjoy the rest of your day.